One small step for man, one giant leap for mankind.
Good evening. Hang on. Stick that mic up. Good evening, YouTube, and welcome to the very first show in what I hope will be a long series of shows where we talk to some very cool people about what they think about, well, life, the universe, and everything. Joining me tonight is a very special guest. I should just, hang on, just let me do a little mix here. Sorry, I'm a bit behind. Joining me tonight is a very special guest who you can now see. Sorry, I'm blundering a little bit. He holds a PhD in astronomy and is a distinguished Professor Emeritus at the University of South Carolina-Lancaster, where he taught physics and astronomy for 26 years. Since January 2013, he has been staff astronomer at Answers in Genesis in northern Kentucky. And he is author of a number of books, including Falling Flat, a refutation of flat Earth claims, and The Created Cosmos, What the Bible Reveals About Astronomy. Please welcome Dr. Danny Faulkner. Welcome, Danny.
Thank you.
You don't mind if I call you Danny, do you?
Please do. Please do.
Okay, cool. Now, most people, I think in our audience might know you from as the guy who was harangued by Nathan Thompson at the Flat Earth Convention, at the last Flat Earth Convention, who insisted on you answering his question, and you didn't. So, I know you've been to a number of these Flat Earth conventions. How did you? What's your experience like? How did you find the Flat Earth conventions?
Well, I've been to three of them now: 2017, 2018, 2019. At the first one, I didn't know what to expect. I was there to research and to learn, but I kind of wanted to slide under the radar because I didn't know how people would receive me being there, not being a flat earther, being a critic of flat Earth movement. Turns out they were very nice to me. I kind of came out of the closet with them and didn't hide. And I made some friends there. So I went back the next two meetings as well. And with the exception of the ambush you mentioned by Nathan, they've all treated me very well. I've gotten to know many of the leaders in the movement, plus other people as well. I've had people I've gone back to see after meeting them at a previous meeting. So I had a good time, made friends there. And it's really been a pleasant time for me. Quite a pleasant surprise. I have no complaints about it.
Cool. So I'm not sure if they're planning one for next year, but would you go again? I think if there is one.
Probably. It depends where it is and when it will be. But I don't know for sure. But they've not announced one yet. There's some question about the leadership for the next one because Robbie Davidson's made it clear that he wants to hand it off to somebody else. So there's been no announcement, but if they have one, I may go again.
Cool. Okay. So tell me, how did you first come across Flat Earth and what motivated you to write a book about it? Your book is Falling Flat.
Yeah. Well, it's 4 years ago. I had conversation with three different people in the course of a week that were concerned about young people they knew who had gotten into this. And I realized, well, there must be something going on. So I dived into it. It turns out over the previous 5 years or so, about every 6 months, somebody would send me something, but I didn't really connect the dots. It was just starting then, a nascent movement, and I didn't pick up on it until 4 years ago. And then since then, I delved into it. I've researched, I've read a number of books written more than a century ago on the first incarnation of the Flat Earth movement. I've read several ones written in recent years. I've watched far more hours of YouTube videos than I would care to admit to. I've read a lot of information online. When I go to the Flat Earth conferences, I listen. I go to all the sessions I can. I talk to people, interview people. So I've done my homework. I've delved into this. And over the time, I've written about 20 articles that have gone on the Answers in Genesis website, different issues I want to answer. So I answered that and we put it up on the website. And sometime last year, I began deciding that I should combine all these, edit it, and add a lot more material. So I wrote the book last year. I finished the draft of it probably in the spring. It came out in September. So it's been out a few months.
Where's it available if people want to get hold of it, by the way? I should.
Well, we carry it, answersingenesis.org. You have an office there in the UK. It's in Leicester. They carry the book as well. But we carry it. Of course, other places will carry it as well, I'm sure. But we certainly keep them in stock and sell them here, and also through internet orders as well.
Yeah, there's digital copies available because I got a digital copy of it. So.
Yes, there's a digital copy available. The cost of the book, I think, is around $15 or $17 US. I'm not sure what they charge in the UK.
Right. I don't think it was that much for the digital copy anyway. I think that was quite...
Yeah, it's cheaper that way, usually is.
Yeah, yeah. So now at the start of the book, you talk about how people are often unprepared to respond to flat earth arguments. Why do you think that is?
Improper education, poor education. Most of us were raised up being taught that everybody thought the world was flat until 500 years ago when Christopher Columbus showed otherwise. And that's not true at all. That myth arose in the 19th century. The truth of the matter is people in the West have known the Earth as a sphere going back about 2,500 years. Well, we know that Pythagoras in the 6th century was talking about that. We don't know his reasons, but by 350 BC, Aristotle wrote a book on the heavens where he gave several good arguments for the Earth being a sphere. So the notion that everybody thought the world was flat in the West until recently is not true. That was a myth that arose in the 19th century. And when we grow up, we're told the Earth is a globe from earliest age. I remember learning about it before I went to school, but no one ever told me why we knew that, how we knew that. Right. As an astronomer, I do know a number of reasons why, going back to Aristotle and others we can put in there. Sometimes people will say, well, we got pictures from space, but we've only been doing that for about 60 years. I think the belief the Earth is a globe goes back a lot earlier than that. Plus, and make note, I've been saying this for years, such photos could be faked.
Right.
I've been saying that for 30 or 40 years to people. So appealing to space photos is not probably the best approach to do this. But most people have never been taught. They've been, why we believe it's a globe. They've been taught facts and figures. That's much of education. Memorize this, memorize that, but you don't assimilate and put these things together and synthesize them. So when somebody comes along with a few clever arguments that they've never encountered before, the average person is totally unprepared to handle those. There are good answers and good responses, but most people don't know them.
Right. I'd agree. I mean, that certainly was my experience when I first came across it. And I know when I speak to a lot of people from this side of the argument, they tell me that they've learned a lot from being in it, because most people, as you say, they don't know how to answer these things. Even people who are quite familiar, I think, with physics and astronomy, they'll get some things, but they won't be able to get them all, So now it's common to hear flat earthers conflating flat earth ideas with geocentrism. What do you think about that?
Well, that's, again, another part of the problem as well. People did believe that the Earth was the center of the universe until about 4 centuries ago. In 1600, that was a dominant belief in the West. By 1700, virtually nobody in the West believed that anymore. They chucked the geocentrism in favor of heliocentrism, the sun being the center, at least of the solar system. But sometimes people just confuse those two. They think that Copernicus invented the spherical Earth. That's not true. And he is the guy who reintroduced and gets the credit for reintroducing the heliocentric theory 500 years ago. So that's a common mistake that people make, but the flat earthers seem to have latched onto that one really big. They're not the only people making that mistake, though.
Right. I mean, I hear...
Again, it's poor education, I think, is a problem there.
Right. Okay. Now, two early Christian flat earthers that you mentioned in your book were...
Cosmos and Lactantius. Yeah.
Oh, thank you so much for saying those for me.
Now we can get those out of the way real fast. That was the idea that everybody thought the world was flat. It was invented by some skeptics, some atheists and agnostics, who are wishing to attack the authority of Scripture and undermine Christianity. And their arguments seem to be there in the 19th century. Look, the church got the shape of the earth's the shape of the earth wrong. And here's an opportunity to get it to redeem yourself by getting in on the ground floor of Darwinism. And this ploy actually worked very well. It converted a lot of churchmen over to belief in evolution, but it also changed our whole attitude about these things. And so to make their case, the skeptics brought up Cosmos and Lactantius, saying that they believed the earth was flat, and indeed they did. However, these people are not well known. The only thing they're really known for is believing that the earth was flat. Everybody else thought otherwise.
Right.
So they stayed only for that. If it weren't for that, we would have, who are they, would be the response when their names are mentioned, if they're mentioned at all. They hardly represent the mainstream of Christianity. They're outliers in that respect. There are numerous examples of people within the church throughout the Middle Ages referring to the earth's sphericity. So they're brought out as kind of the exhibit A to prove that the Bible somehow says the earth is flat, but they're not good examples at all.
Right. Right. Can you comment on how modern flat earthers try to tie the flat earth idea to earlier Christian beliefs?
Well, they try to argue that the church thought the earth was flat, that it's buying the lie that was introduced in the 19th century. They try to argue that belief in evolution didn't start with Darwin. It started really with the geocentrism being kicked to the curb, and also the belief that the earth was a sphere. They say that's the real root of the problem. And then they try to argue in Scripture that the earth is flat. But, you'd think if the Bible teaches that the earth is flat, there would be a verse somewhere that says something like, oh, the earth is flat. But there is such a verse anywhere. People will take certain passages. They claim 200 plus 240 verses, and they will then put their own unique interpretation or spin upon these things, on these verses. And I've examined all 200, 240 of them, and they fall woefully short. You have to go with their understanding of what these verses mean, kind of read between the lines and fill it in. So it's really not a good argument at all, I don't believe.
Right. So I know that the sort of a lot of the arguments that we see now were from the revival in the 19th century with Robotham and Carpenter.
Right.
How do you think their ideas relate to the modern version of the idea?
Well, they've been lifted entirely from them. One of the people who really reintroduced this idea in the 21st century was Eric Dubay. And he, if you read his one book, the Flat Earth Conspiracy, that one is heavily redacted from Robotham and from Carpenter, but more so his other book on the subject, 200 Proofs the Earth is not a rotating globe. That was kind of an update, I think, supposed to be of Carpenter's book, but that's nearly the same title, 100 Proofs. So he just kind of doubled the number. If you go through that book, you'll find that he lifts word for word what Carpenter said. So the entire movement was started in the 21st century, borrowing heavily, particularly from those two sources, but a few others. And I do see flat earthers continually repeating arguments from Carpenter, Robotham, also a few other names out there as well. David Wardlow Scott is another one that gets quoted quite a bit. So it's a rehash of 19th century ideas in many respects, and then a few things added on top of that.
Right. I should mention, I know you mention the Bedford Level experiment in your book, and then you also talk about the Chicago skyline. You also talk about a flat Earth in relation to astronomy, in relation to physics. You talk about geocentrism. You talk about the NASA arguments. It really is a very comprehensive debunk of flat Earth. What I thought made it unusual, I think more probably unique, is that you present these arguments from physics and astronomy, but you also address these biblical arguments. And I think very few people are addressing the biblical arguments, but I don't think anyone is addressing the biblical arguments and doing the physics and astronomy. So it's well worth a read, I would say.
Well, thank you.
You mentioned a couple of your own observations and experiments that you did as part of your flat Earth refutation. So can you tell us about those?
Okay, well, I've observed many lunar eclipses. In fact, I include some photos of a lunar eclipse I took back in January of last year, and that's one of the things that you can do for yourself. You see the shadow falling on the moon, and it's always a circle. It's never any other shape, and the only shape that will produce a round shadow is a sphere, regardless of orientation. For me, last year, the eclipse happened at midnight, so if the Earth were round and flat, it could make a circular shadow. But a friend of mine happened to be in Hawaii at the same time, watching it at sunset. And the flat, round Earth would not cast a circular shadow for him, yet it was. Now, of course, the flat earthers have a response to this. They deny that that's what's causing an eclipse. They say that that's not the Earth's shadow falling on the moon. So I asked them, well, what causes an eclipse, a lunar eclipse? And they don't have an answer. And they don't seem to be curious about what causes them. It's most interesting thing. They say, I don't know, and I don't really care, but I don't know what causes an eclipse, but I know what doesn't cause an eclipse. And that's kind of a weird way of looking at the world. I've also traveled quite a bit, and as I do, the stars, as I travel northward, in the northern part of the sky get higher. The stars in the southern part of the sky get lower and even disappear. I was in Scotland 15 months ago, and up in Edinburgh, and the North Star, which is near the North Celestial Pole, was almost 2/3 the way up, almost 60 degrees above the horizontal. Where I live here in Kentucky, it's a little less than 40 degrees, not even halfway up. A few months after that, I was in South Florida, and the North Star was very low in the sky. And a month later, in March of last year, I was in South Africa. You can't see the North Star at all from there, but there are plenty of stars down there you can't see from here. Now, this makes no sense on a flat Earth with a dome over top, but it's exactly what you would expect to see if the Earth is a sphere, is a globe. Right. And I think the aspects of the sky is one of the best arguments one can make for the Earth being a sphere. The problem is most people are very ignorant of all these things. They have no idea what I'm talking about for the most part, but any amateur astronomer that knows much at all about the sky will know exactly what I'm talking about. This just screams the Earth is a globe. Those are the kind of experiments I've done. I've also done some others. I took some photographs of a departing cargo ship about 3 years ago. It was at Virginia Beach in November. It was a cold autumn day. The water temperature was about a dozen degrees warmer than the air temperature. It was a very raw day. Not the kind of day you want to go to the beach. I had a telescope with a 1,400 millimeter focal length on it. And that beats, by the way, the P900 and P1000. It's got 2.5 times the focal length they have. So don't tell me I'm using the wrong equipment. And I took these photographs of this cargo ship, and as it sailed out out of port, out to the Atlantic Ocean, the hull progressively disappeared. The hull was completely gone, and then eventually all the rows of cargo containers disappeared. All was left at the end was the bridge castle. I had to stop because it was approaching sunset, and I was losing light terribly, but the thing was disappearing hull first. It's important you do these experiments when there's not a temperature inversion so you don't get a superior mirage. It's a mistake that flat earthers make again and again. Another experiment I've done, actually several experiments extensively, is looking at the light of the moon. One of the claims about this goes back to Rowbottom. They claim that the light of the moon is cooling. You know, things left in moonlight are at lower temperature. And I've seen all these experiments done on the internet, and many of them I can see what they're doing wrong. Others, it's so dark I can't make out what they're doing wrong. But I've developed 3 different experiments that I've done repeatedly. One of them about 40 times, and the others a bit less than that. And I find consistently the moon's light is not cooling at all. It's not heating either. It doesn't really change anything. And this is one of those things I've done extensive testing of on my own. So I do these experiments on my own. I've done many, many others. Those are some of the ones that come to mind readily.
Cool. So sticking with astronomy, how do we know the Earth is orbiting the sun?
Oh, that's a tough one. People People accepted the heliocentric model 400 years ago in the 17th century without any direct proof of it. At the time, people generally believed the Ptolemaic model, which has epicycles and such. And some of the observations that Galileo made with his telescope disproved the Ptolemaic model. It could not work. And so that drove most of them the heliocentric model. But the main argument was simplicity. It was a much simpler model, explained the motions of the planets very simply, whereas the geocentric models did not. And the first direct evidence that the Earth is moving around the sun came in 1727. A guy named James Bradley, an Englishman, first measured what we call aberration of starlight. And then 110 years later, several people observed what we call trigonometric parallax or stellar parallax, stars appearing to shift position from one side of the Earth's orbit to the other because of our motion around the sun. And in the 1880s, we've had periodic Doppler shifts as we move toward and away from stars in orbit. As we go around like this, the spectral lines tend to shift towards the red, towards the blue, towards the red, towards the blue, by just the amount and in the manner you would expect if we were orbiting the sun, with a light travel time of about 8 minutes and 20 seconds. And in the work I've been doing for 40 years in eclipsing binary stars, I have to make what's called a heliocentric correction. If when we're looking at the star form one side of the Earth's orbit, the eclipses occur about 8 minutes earlier, and on the other side about 8 minutes late. Again, indicative that we're orbiting around the sun. So we've got a number of evidences that we are indeed orbiting the sun. And when flat earthers blithely state that there's no evidence we orbit the sun, that is just nonsense. It's not true at all. It's complete fabrication, complete lies, and they're relying upon other flat earthers that either were lying or didn't know what they were talking about.
Okay. So it's good to have an answer to that question, because I think, as you say, you often hear that argument, and it is a difficult one, I think, it's certainly for the man in the street to answer anyway, I think.
Yeah. I've had people ask me that at the Flat Earth Convention. One woman asked me that question, and I started running them off the list of stuff, and she just folded her tent and moved on to the next point. That's kind of response that I get when people ask me that. I give them the answer, and they move on to the next point. It doesn't phase them one way or the other. They're not about to change their mind, but they're not about to engage me and discuss with me about it.
That's been my experience too. Now, there's an argument that's popular among flat earthers, which defines science only as experiments performed to a specific set of steps. This argument also defines astronomy, geology, and paleontology as pseudoscience. How do you respond to this argument, and how do you define science?
All right. This is one of the arguments, one of the things I did not deal with in my book. I guess I really wasn't confronted with it until after I had sent my book off to the publisher. I do have an article coming out on our website, answersingenesis.org, and it will come out in the next couple of weeks, where I deal with this very thing. And I think the problem is that people are spoon-fed as children in their education. They're spoon-fed a very simplistic definition of science, where you have an independent variable and a dependent variable, and you go through the experiment. And it's that whole thing is geared, that whole definition of science is geared towards experimental science, like you might find in biology or something like that. But it's very, very simplistic, and it's at best maybe a sixth grade understanding of science. Science is much more involved than that. It does involve experiment, but it also involves observation. We use inductive reasoning for the most part in science. It's a study of the natural world using the five senses, and we make induction and conclusions using inductive reasoning, some of it based on experiment, some based on observation. So I hear flat earthers all the time dismissing a lot of the conclusions we can safely reach, such as the phases of the moon. We can watch the moon over the course of month after month after month, and it's very clear then, using inductive reasoning, what's going on. The moon is a sphere, it's a ball, it's a globe, and the sun is illuminating it from one side, so half of it is fully illuminated, one half is dark, and as the moon orbits around the Earth every month, the amount of that lit half changes. That's why we go from new to crescent to first quarter to waxing gibbous to full, and then through the waning phases back to new again. It's a very robust explanation. Is it an experimental science? No. It's an observational science, but you can make inferences from the observations that you make. And so I can't emphasize this enough. People who make this criticism are just simply going through life with a very elementary view of what science is. And again, you can thank their education for not giving them a good education. They've been mal-educated along the way, and it's unfortunate that's the case.
It's so good to hear someone with a PhD say that, because this argument is often supported by citations from that are cherry picked, and and obviously on addressing the issue fully. So
Yeah.
it's good
And
to hear
the people
someone.
the people they're referencing would strongly disagree with what's being done in their name. So it is being cherry picked and taken out of context in some respect.
Right. So now, as someone who believes that the Earth and the universe were created more recently than the current mainstream view, do you see this same apparent contradiction in your own astronomical observations? And if you do, how do you explain this?
Okay, well, I'm swimming upstream. I am a biblical creationist. I believe that the world is only thousands of years old.
Hmm.
And some people might say, well, wait a minute, how are you different from a flat earther?
Hmm.
And I get that criticism. One difference is the fact that the history of the world is past. It's what we call a historical or origin science. The shape of the Earth, though, is what we call an observational experimental science. It exists in the here and now, and we can actually test it. The rules are very different in that respect. My job as a creation scientist is to offer arguments of why I believe it's reasonable we live in a universe that was created in the recent past and not over long billions of years of time. And I think that part of the flat earth movement has been motivated by an attempt to undermine people like me and what we're talking about.
Right. Um, how does science? This is probably could be a huge answer to this question. So I'm not sure how fair it is even to ask it. But how does science lead you to the conclusion that the universe has a creator as opposed to any only naturalistic origins?
Oh boy, yeah, that gets into a lot of philosophy. When you start talking about these sorts of things, it starts with your assumptions. If you start with the assumption of naturalism, that you will allow only naturalistic explanations, that only that is non-supernatural explanations, then you will be forced to abide by those rules if you're going to be consistent. And here's the problem. Suppose that there's something that has no physical or natural explanation, such as the origin of life. I think good science indicates that life does not have a naturalistic origin.
Hmm.
So if you're committed to naturalism, you've got a conundrum here because naturalism can't answer the question. So what you end up doing is creating an explanation. It doesn't matter how improbable, how illogical, or how convoluted it is, because that's the only option you have, you go with that. I mean, I talked about life, good science. We have this law of biogenesis that life only comes from life. Yet, if you believe in a naturalistic origin, you must accept the fact that somewhere along the line that rule was broken, and there's no science indicating that's the case. And I think the modern idea of the origin of the universe is the Big Bang, and I don't know if we want to get into that at all today, but that's to me is an attempt to explain the world in a naturalistic way, and it has a multitude of problems with it. To me, I think it's illogical to assume that the universe just happened by itself. I think good science again indicates that there should be an agent behind the creation of the universe. Does it tell me it's only thousands of years old? Well, no, that by itself doesn't do that. But that's the kind of thing I'm talking about. It comes down to the philosophical assumptions one starts with.
Okay. Interesting. I've heard this, this sort of philosophical approach before, and I guess it's kind of one of the things that led me away from, being involved in the sort of atheist Christian debate some years ago, because to be honest, I tired of the endless philosophy in the end.
Yeah.
It's hard work, that philosophy stuff. Yeah, so anyway, I think we've got time for some questions from the chat now. In fact, what I'll do is I've got a couple of questions left. What I wanted to ask you about was the Book of Enoch. So if I can ask you about the Book of Enoch, what is the Book of Enoch? And while you're answering that, I'll round up a couple more questions from the chat from you.
Okay, Enoch is a what we call a pseudepigraphal book. Enoch was the seventh patriarch from Adam. He lived between Adam and Noah, and it says in the Genesis account that Enoch was a righteous man, and God took him. He didn't see death. He was translated into heaven. One of only two people that happened to, as far as we know. And there began circulating around the second century BC, or maybe third century BC, a book called One Enoch, and we call the Book of Enoch. And the Jude, in his epistle in the New Testament, quotes a small snippet of this work. And so many people say, wait a minute, because it's quoted in the New Testament, that means it must be significant and important. So they want to reference that. Now, again, Jude only quotes one verse from it. It's a very long book, like 80 chapters or something. It's a rather lengthy thing. I've read it, most of it at least. And the Book of Enoch is believed to be pseudepigraphal. That means that it was not actually written by Enoch, because Enoch died or was translated to heaven long millennia before the book actually was written. We're not sure if the copy we have now available to us was the one circulating in the first century anyway, because it really was based on some manuscripts found much, much, much later. The book in there does talk about cosmology a bit more. It does seem to indicate something like a flat earth in it. And that's the reason why flat earthers love this book. They like to say that it should have been in the Bible. It never was and never should have been. I think there are many problems with it. It's not considered a canonical book by Christians at all, for the most part. There are a few sects in Ethiopia that like it, but other than that, it's just considered an interesting book. So to the flat earthers, it's really important, because a large part of the teachings they want to come from that book. So we've been around and around and around on that one. I have a whole chapter in my book about the Book of Enoch and what's wrong with it.
Okay. Right. Some questions from the chat. This is an interesting one. Where is the problem with the Big Bang from a strictly observational sense?
Oh boy. That can take a while. I'll just give a few things. I've noticed over the past 50 years, it's been the dominant cosmology. And the Big Bang's basically the belief that the universe suddenly appeared in a very hot, dense state a few billion years ago. Now thinking 13.8 billion years ago. It was expanding, and the state it came into, and as it expanded, it cooled, and into the universe that we see today. Over the years, I've seen it change quite a bit. The expansion rate has changed, hence the age has changed. We've started putting in dark matter in the last 25 or 30 years, dark energy more recently than that. We've added a number of other bells and whistles as time went by. The Big Bang model today is very different from the Big Bang model of, say, 30 years ago. All sorts of things have been added to it. The model's almost unrecognizable. And it seems to me every time a new problem comes up, like they had a thing called, back in the 70s, they had a couple things called the horizon problem and the flatness problem. Thank you. I just suddenly remember what it was. Flatness and horizon problems. It has nothing to do with flat Earth, by the way. And they solved that, they thought, in the 1980s with the introduction of inflation, the idea that there was this hyper expansion that took place far faster than the speed of light in the first 10 to the minus 34 seconds or so of the Big Bang universe. They don't know what caused it. They don't know what caused it to stop, but they're convinced it happened. Otherwise, their model is rubbish. And I see that over the years, they keep adding these different things, because every time they need to solve a problem, they do this. And I have a problem with with a theory that's continually modified, that was assuring us 50 years ago and 40 years ago and 30 years ago, yes, this is how the world came to be. But again, the model keeps changing. So which one is it? Which version is it? It's a very plastic model that can be changed and morphed and shaped into to explain any new problem that comes along. A multitude of problems have been set up against it over the past half century, and every time they make up some effect which then solves the problem. Well, if you're going to do that, then no, that's not how science is supposed to work. The Big Bang model, I don't think is falsifiable. I don't think it can be disproved because it's very plastic and be changed according to any new thing that comes along.
Okay. Next question. This is from Gleam. He says, just let me get so I can see it. How is the current model going to resolve the current falsified theories of gravity, as they do not work outside the domain they were designed in, aka the solar system?
Was he talking about dark matter, perhaps?
I think probably, yes.
Okay. All right. Now that sounds like it. I'm very bullish on dark matter. We have evidence for that going back 85 years now. We didn't know what to make of it for the first 50 years. The gravity does work. It just, the distribution we're seeing of it doesn't match the lighted distribution. We've assumed all along that where you see a lot of light, it's a lot of stars, which means a lot of mass, but it doesn't necessarily follow. We can map out the dynamic matter of the universe by the gravitational forces or attractions that are required, or we observe actually, and then you can map out the lighted matter, and they don't match. They're in different locations, and so I don't think it's a problem at all. In fact, if you abandon dark matter, as weird as it is, you have to then alter physics as we know it, alter gravitation. It's possible that's the case, but I think dark matter is a far less radical approach to this, and I think eventually we will identify what it is.
Awesome. Okay, from Gently's channel, he says, as a creationist, where did God get the building blocks for the universe if something cannot come from nothing?
Yeah, well, that's a very good question. The answer is God is transcendent of nature. God created nature. He created the universe. He created the matter and energy of the universe. So that is the uncaused cause, as it were, of everything around us.
Okay. Let me just read this one. Sorry. Okay. How do you choose to side with the established science for our cosmology and yet still deny parts of it because it goes against the biblical story?
Yeah, fair question. Very good question, and I'm not afraid to answer that one. Again, it comes back to the difference between historical or origin science and observation or experimental science. You know, we creationists, we don't have a problem with most of science. That's a mistake many people make. I know many fellow creationists who have PhDs in various fields from very good universities. We agree with most of basically what science says. I like dark matter, for instance. I like black holes. I like all sorts of cool things in astronomy. Where we differ is the origin and the history of the world, because again, we can't directly observe that, and the rules of evidence are very different in the way we treat historical origin science and experimental observational science, and that gets confused all the time. But that's the only difference we have here.
Okay. Now, there's a couple of Hebrew words that we hear a lot, which are the one that they use for NASA, that they say means deceive. And there's another one, I think, is it rakia? That we hear a lot? Yeah. Can you tell us about those?
Sure. Yeah, the word they're looking for NASA in Hebrew is nashah. All right, it's pronounced very different. The first consonant is the same as NASA, but the second consonant is very different. It's an SH sound rather than S sound, and the vowels are pronounced a bit different. Again, if I say nashah, I don't think anybody other than flat earthers would think NASA. And if I say NASA, no Hebraic person, no person knows Hebrew would think nashah. So this is kind of a lame argument the flat earthers like to grab. Now, the other word rakia is a key part of their argument. The rakia is a word that's a Hebrew word that appears 17 times in the Old Testament. It occurs 9 times in the first chapter of Genesis, and then a few other times in the book of Daniel, the book of Psalms, and also in the Ezekiel's prophecy. And the word was translated firmament by the King James, and more recently people have translated it expanse because that's what the word actually means. The long history here goes back to the Septuagint in the 3rd century or so. So it was the translation of the Hebrew Old Testament into Greek. And when they got to this, they didn't know what to do with it, or they thought they knew what to do with it. They translated it stereoma, which refers to something hard or firm. I believe that was because they did this in Alexandria. They were well versed in the ancient Greek cosmology, which had a spherical Earth surrounded by a hard crystalline sphere to which the stars were attached. Note, it wasn't a dome; it was a sphere. Notice the Earth wasn't flat; it was a globe inside of all of that. And this thing was a stereoma. So when they said, aha, when God made this thing on day 2, this rakia, this is this stereoma we're talking about. So we're going to translate that as stereoma. By the way, on day 4, 2 days later, God placed the luminaries, the sun, the moon, and stars, in this thing that he made on day 2. That's why the translators of the Septuagint translated it rakia. Jerome, a few centuries later, translates the Old and New Testament into Latin. He picked the term, a Latin term, firmamentum. If you look at the first 4 letters, it gives you this idea of firm. That's where we get that word from. And the King James translators merely transliterated firmamentum into English as a new word. What they should have done is gone back and asked, well, what does this term rakia mean? It comes from a verb. It's a noun, but it comes from a verb meaning to stamp or spread or to beat out. You can refer to beating out a metal that way, but also you can refer to stomping your foot as being a raka. And so they say, well, this thing is usually a metal, so therefore it must be hard, and which is a leap of logic. When you make a noun out of a verb, it's never the property of some object of that verb. It's always some property of the verb itself.
Right.
That's a key point, and that's the reason why Hebraists tell us and by the way, I know several world-class Hebraists have been to the very finest schools, and they unanimously tell me that the word rakia means expanse. It's this thing that God spread out on day 2. I think it's referring to the space of the universe. And that's consistent with what we find in the poetic and prophetic books of the Old Testament, God spreading out the heavens. I think that's what it's referring to there. But this is a very key part to the flat earthers' argument. They want to argue that this rakia is this hard dome sitting over top of the earth, and so God makes this dome on day 2. You take that argument away from it, and their argument starts to really collapse pretty quickly.
Right. I've also heard that, or seen that translated in some modern versions. They just translate it as space.
Yeah, I've seen that.
In the way that we use the term space today, which I thought is flat earthers didn't like that one.
Well, I think that's a very good translation, given the way we look at the world today. Now, you got to be very careful because we can easily fall into the same sort of mistake that the translated Septuagint did. They thought their cosmology was this sphere around the earth, and so they thought this is what God created on day 2. So it's okay to do that as long as you realize that maybe, just maybe, your cosmology is wrong after all. Right. I don't think it is, but I think we need to have enough humility to admit that possibility. But space is a good translation, I think.
Yeah. How do you account for supernova observed to have taken place after, they put YEC dates, so that's young Earth creation dates.
Young Earth creation. Okay. This gets into the what we call the light travel time problem, which is a huge problem for us. We need to answer it. I'm not afraid to admit we have a problem there. It gets back to your worldview again. I have a long, I've written on this quite a bit, and I have a long presentation I give. I'll have to give you like a 3-minute version if I have time to do that. But we're concentrating on things today. If I go out tonight and I look, not tonight, but some autumn evening on a clear sky, I can make out the Andromeda Galaxy with my naked eye. It's 2.5 million light years away from us, far greater than 6 to 10,000 light years away from us. So the question is, how can I see that? But we're concentrating on the situations that now exist. You go back to the creation week, you go back to Adam, he had a huge light travel time problem. He looked up the first night, knowing the nearest star is more than 4 light years away. What did he see? Did he see anything? Well, God pronounced this all very good. And what that means is that the things God had made were fulfilling the functions that they were designed to do. They had certain things they had to do, and there are certain things listed in the day 4 account of what the luminaries in the sky were supposed to do for us. If they're not visible, then they can't fulfill their purposes, which would be contradictory to what God had proclaimed. So I believe what happened, and people may not like this, but it is consistent with the miracle of the creation week, is that God miraculously brought that light here on day 4. Maybe day 6, but certainly by day 6, but probably on day 4. Now, how does that explain the supernovae and so forth? I don't really know, but I do believe there was a miracle performed at that point. Some of my creation scientist friends, they want to give a scientific answer for all of that, but they grossly underestimate the whole miracle of creation. My response to them is, well, why don't you just give me a physical mechanism for the virgin birth and resurrection? Those are miracles that have no physical answer either.
Okay. Why has the philosophy of science changed from analyze nature and excuse me, the chat just shut up as I was reading that. Why has the philosophy of science changed from analyze nature and record her to the anti-science of add invisible stuff to nature when your theories don't work?
I guess I don't quite understand the intent of that question. There are many invisible. Well, there are many invisible things that we encounter in the in science, if you will. Like right now, it's very windy here. I look outside and I can't see the wind. It's invisible. I can't see the air. The air should be invisible. If it's not, that's not a good thing. And so I do believe in wind, and I do believe in air. I believe in atoms, even though I've never seen one and never will. If you go to electrical outlet, you got 2 little holes there, and there's an electric field between those 2. You can't see that field, but if you take a paper clip and undo it and stick it into, you will feel the effects of that field, won't you? And magnetic fields as well. I can't see a magnetic field. I can see the effects of it. So there are many things that we believe in and study scientifically in our scientific concepts, even though they are not visible to us. Seeing is not necessarily believing. There's more to it than that. It's a much, much more subtle thing than that.
Okay. Here's an interesting one. Do you think that man will step on Mars within the next 25 years?
Probably not. There's no good reason to go to Mars. I mean, the cost would be astronomical. It'd be probably $1 trillion to do it on the cheap. We went to the moon like a camping trip. 3 days there, 3 days back, a couple of days on the moon. A trip to Mars would be 2 years. You got probably 9 months to a year there, and then back as well, and in between a year or more, about a year in the vicinity of the planet. And you'd have to have triple, quadruple redundancy. You would have to have a surgeon aboard, and a dentist, and an apothecary there, and a surgical room, just in case somebody got sick. If somebody got sick or had appendicitis on going to the moon, well, maybe you can come back and do surgery on them. That's not an option in going to Mars. You better have people who aren't going to get sick for 2 years. We had a woman in Antarctica who was wintering over, and she was a physician, and she self-diagnosed she had cancer. And they went to extraordinary effort to evacuate her in the winter to get her out of there. That happened about 10 or 15 years ago. You can't do that going to Mars. So it's a daunting task. We have the technology, we have the ability, but do we have the political will to do it? And what's the reason for going there? Robotic spacecraft can do it much better. So as a taxpayer, I'm opposed to this. I think we can do it much better and cheaper without people getting involved.
What about going back to the moon? What do you think about that?
Not a good reason to go back. I mean, the moon has no resources that we want. We went there 50 years ago to beat the Soviets. It was a Cold War. It was done for nationalistic purposes. We kind of threw in a little science along the way, too, and that was good. It was a good thing to do, but it was also extremely expensive. The Apollo program was hauling down 3% of the U.S. budget at the time, which is a huge amount for an extravagance like that. So there's just no good reason to go back. I'm opposed to that as well. We can send robotic spacecraft now at a fraction of the cost.
Right. What do you think about life on other planets? Do you think that that's a likely possibility?
I don't think so. I've mentioned before the law of biogenesis. Life comes from life. If there is life elsewhere in the universe, I'm firmly convinced that God created it. So now it's not a scientific question at all. It's a theological and philosophical question. And the way I understand Scripture and the way that the world works, I believe that we are alone in the universe because God has ordained that we're like that. Now, it may seem strange to people for a scientist to say that, but there is no scientific evidence that life exists anywhere. In fact, there's good evidence that we are alone from science.
I'm running out of questions, I think. Have you got another one for me, Lewis? Bear with me a second. Hopefully,
You'd
Lewis.
think a lot of flat earthers would be out there tonight.
Yeah, we've got about 50 people watching. There's a few people, one or two from that side of the argument that I can see. One of them's just had his message deleted, I think. Have you got any more for me, Lewis? I've got a guy who's in my chat just gathering them for me, so I don't have to read it all. I'm pretty much out, I think, of questions.
Oh, wow.
Just that I know we got through them all. He says that's it, they're running dry. Bear with me. I think I might have one or two more on my list here. Bear with me. Or did we get through them all? I thought there were far more than we would need for this. So
I was trying to be succinct in my answers. We can go back and revisit if you want.
No, it's no problem at all. So, I mean, what do you see? What do you think is the future then for flat Earth? How do you see it? Or, well, can I ask, how have you seen it change since you've been following it, and where do you see it going? Would probably be.
Well, I don't know if it's changed so much. It's been driven by the internet. The internet and YouTube has made it possible. If it weren't for the internet, we wouldn't be having this conversation. That's quite literal, actually, when you think about it. But really, it's being fed by this. We have a whole subculture of people who get all their information on YouTube and other internet sources. It's driven the flat Earth movement is a large part of the conspiracy movement. People who believe that there are far greater things at work in the world, and that everything's being manipulated. And these people are actually quite disengaged from society in many respects. So it's an interesting sociological study. I've had discussions with people. They ask, is it a cult? Because the flat Earth movement didn't start off that way necessarily, but it certainly has a strong Christian influence on it. It was at the last flat Earth conference. It seemed to have that flavor more than the previous two, and I think if we would have taken a survey, most of them would have considered themselves devout Christians, though not all are. And that then you have to ask the question: is it a cult? And it has certain aspects of the cult. The one thing that's missing is that a cult is usually defined in terms of a charismatic leader leading it. And there doesn't appear to be a single leader in the flat Earth movement. There are several out there, but no single one at all. And so I'm thinking maybe it's time in the internet age to revisit the definition of what a cult is. Maybe the leader is the internet at this point. But it has very cult-like connections to it. And I don't think it's going away anytime soon. I don't know if it's peaked yet. There have been people fighting back. When I started fighting back 4 years ago, it seemed like there was nobody out there. There are more and more people now responding with YouTube videos and so forth. I'm not a video guy myself. I like to write rather than do videos. But there are also, I think Facebook has and YouTube have both been kind of intimidated a bit because some of the conspiracy theories out there that have been promulgated on those two platforms have come back to bite people. That people have taken action sometimes. There was one particularly here in the United States, who somebody went to go rescue some kids at a pizza parlor, and it turned out he was completely wrong, and he'd been misled by this. And so, because of all of this, and with the arguments about fake news, both YouTube and Facebook have attempted to rein in some of the more crazy things out there, and it has forced down some of the channels that flat earthers had, and of course to them it just feeds their conspiracy mind. So people are combating it, but the movement continues to grow, and I don't know when this thing will peak out. I hope it peaks out soon. I'd be happy if it did.
Right. I think it may have done already. I mean, I certainly see less content now, excuse me, than I used to. And I don't mean, I mean, obviously YouTube, we know, aren't recommending flat earth videos, but, I specifically search for flat earth videos, and I just don't see I don't see the amount or the type of things being uploaded that I used to see.
That there used to be. That has, I noticed a change in the content as well, but I do believe the converts are still coming.
Yeah,
and
that's true.
That concerns me.
I do still come across new people, although we have a few fence jumpers the other way from time to time. They do come along, so they don't always win. Okay, a couple more questions now. What is the origin of cosmic background radiation, if not the Big Bang?
Very good question. I've been asked for many years, and for many years I didn't have an answer, but about 4 or 5 years ago I developed one, and I wasn't even looking for it. My thinking about biblical cosmology changed about 4 or 5 years ago. I was looking at this Rakia in great depth, and I didn't always believe it was the space of the universe. One thing I left out when I mentioned the Rakia earlier, its purpose in day 2 was to separate waters above from waters below. So I've come to believe that the universe has an edge to it, because the Rakia has an edge to it, and that's anathema to modern cosmology. There is no edge, and if it has an edge, then biblically speaking, there's water at that edge, and if there's water, then it is made out of matter, what we call baryonic matter. Water is normal matter, as it were, and according to the third law of thermodynamics, it's going to have to radiate. And so imagine you're sitting here at the Earth, somewhere near the center of the universe, and I believe the Earth is somewhere close to the center. Can't prove that, but that's my cosmology now, and that's a huge change for me. And if you've got this shell of water at a tremendous distance from us, then there must be radiation coming to us from all directions in space. What form that water has doesn't really matter. It's going to radiate, and it's going to have probably something close to a black body curve. And it's a fact that distant objects, their light is redshifted. That's called the Hubble Relation. That was established almost 100 years ago now by Evan Hubble. It's been confirmed many times since. So whatever this water giving off radiation, its radiation is going to be redshifted. How much, I don't know, but it's going to be redshifted. It's going to be pretty cool radiation. So I think the CMB is actually water, emission from water coming from where God put it on the second day of creation.
Cool. Okay, here's an interesting one. Do you believe any kind of prophecies?
Yes, particularly biblical prophecies. We find numerous Old Testament prophecies that Jesus fulfilled in the New Testament. Like, for instance, where he was born was foretold by Micah. The book of Isaiah talks about his suffering, which was something that the Jews at the time couldn't really comprehend. And there are many prophecies that Jesus fulfilled. There are many other prophecies in the Old Testament and the New that don't appear to me to have been fulfilled yet. One of these is the fact that Jesus promised to return as a conquering king, not as a servant as he did the first time. And I think that's one prophecy that will happen. And the Lord's return is certainly one of the great hopes that we Christians have.
Great. Can you explain how the universe has expanded as far as it has?
No. I don't know if anybody really can. It's an observational. Well, let me step back a second. What Hubble found in 1929 was that redshift is correlated with with distance. The farther away something is, the more it's redshifted. Now, the simplest, most direct interpretation of that is that the universe is expanding. Now, that is an interpretation. All Hubble found was that relationship between redshift and distance. Interpretation is a bit different. And I used to think, I said for a long time when I was teaching, I would tell my students that, Hubble proved that the universe is expanding. Well, he didn't quite do that. He proved that redshift and distance are correlated, and then we interpret that as such. And I think that's a good interpretation. However, my mind is open to other possible interpretations. And as a scientist, I ought to be. I'm like 95% convinced it's expansion, but the last 5% of me says, well, maybe it's not, but what is it? I can't think of anything else.
Okay. Now, this is quite a long question here. He said that flat Earth is largely the result of undereducated. How does he feel about the undereducated on the globe side that are often just as wrong and exhibit nearly as much Dunning-Kruger?
I agree. I belong to one discussion group out there. I'm very careful. It's a small group, and I have seen in that group some arguments that people who believe the Earth is a globe have made me cringe. And when I do, I'm not loath to say, hey, this is wrong. You did this wrong. This is not. And sometimes from every couple of weeks, someone will put an argument up. Well, this is an argument for the Earth being a globe. I'm saying, no, that's a terrible argument. No, don't use that argument. So I agree. There are people out there who are hot to trot on this, but they don't know much more or any more than some flat earthers do.
Yeah, I mean, I must admit, I've experienced that too. I mean, to be fair, I've probably been one of those people making terrible arguments from time to time as well. Although I think I've learned a bit over the years, but I do still hear some bad arguments sometimes. Okay, I guess I've got to hit you with this one, I'm afraid. It was actually the first question that was asked this afternoon when I went live. How can you have gas pressure next to a vacuum?
Okay. In fact, that was the question that Nathan was
exactly
with.
I thought this would be a good place for us to finish.
Yeah. He was put up there. Here's the problem, and I've argued with flat earthers about this until I've gotten blue in the face. The argument is that you've got the Earth. They have a caricature of what we're saying the Earth is like. You've got the Earth sitting here; it's a globe. And then there's the atmosphere around. Saying, wait a minute, the atmosphere out here in space, it's a vacuum, and you have air pressure here next to each other. That can't happen. It's just going to be sucked out like this. There's several things wrong with it. First of all, what is a vacuum? If you pick a dictionary definition, and flat earthers like to do that, a dictionary definition is it's a volume or a region that is devoid of matter. Well, I got news for you. No such thing exists. There's no place in the universe that there's nothing at all.
Right.
The real definition of a vacuum is a region at lower pressure. That's all that it is. You go down the road and you open up a little window in your car, you have got a vacuum right there. We produce vacuums all the time. If you blow over the edge of something like this, you get a vacuum. An airplane wing is designed so that the air travels a little different on top and bottom of the wing, and it produces a vacuum on the top. It's lower pressure. It's not zero. There's plenty of material there. So the mistaken number one is that they're assuming that a vacuum is something that it is not. It's simply lower pressure. Now, the atmosphere doesn't go from one atmosphere to zero, effectively zero pressure. That's the way they have it. We have one atmosphere pressure, and all of a sudden, poof, it becomes the vacuum of space, quote unquote. That's not how it works. As you rise up through the atmosphere, the pressure gradually decreases. If you drive around in a hilly, mountainous area, your ears pop. If you want to do it right, take a real good barometer with you and measure that. Pressure drops when you. I went to Pikes Peak 15 years ago up there. It's at 14,000 feet above sea level. I'll let you folks worry about what that is in meters. And up there, the pressure was about 60% of what it is at the ground. When you get about 120,000 feet, it's only 1% of this. So you have a vacuum right over your head. Right as I'm sitting here, the air is at lower pressure around my head than it is around my feet. It's not much of a difference, but it is lower pressure, and that lower pressure goes all the way up. Now, there's no container between my feet and my head. There's no container between the bottom of the mountains there in Colorado and Pikes Peak on the top. There's no container between anywhere in the atmosphere and 100,000 feet up. And yet you have this vacuum existing at higher pressure. If the flat earthers are right about that, then all the air lower elevation on the Earth should rise up quickly and equalize. It doesn't. It doesn't do that. I've just given multiple examples here of a vacuum coexisting with a non-vacuum without a container. And if you can figure out why that exists in a stable situation in the Earth's atmosphere, you've just answered the question of why you can have the vacuum of space, quote unquote, and not rob the Earth of its atmosphere. I won't convince many flat earthers on that, but that is the answer. They don't like it because that's such a good talking point. They're not about to give it up, even though they're wrong about it.
Right. It's great to hear it answered from you, though. And I think that is a good place for us to finish. We're an hour in, which is what we were aiming at. So thank you so much for being my first guest. It's
it's a pleasure. I'll do it again.
Awesome. Brilliant. Thank you very much. Thank you to our wonderful audience for being with us. Don't forget to check out Dr. Danny Faulkner's book, which is Falling Flat, A Refutation of Flat Earth Claims. Oh, there it is. Awesome. I probably should have had a graphic for that, shouldn't I? And we'll be back again soon. I'm hoping to be back at the same time next week if I can get a guest. So until then, thanks all for being here. Thank you, Danny. And we'll see you all again soon.